Is China really an enemy to Africa, or is the West just rattled with the kind of influence that China is amassing on the continent, and hence it's running a smear campaign against China by saying things like, oh, be very careful about China, be careful about the money they're giving you, be careful about their projects, be careful of your interactions with them because there's an ulterior motive. Well, I have a question. When has the West never had ulterior motive when dealing with Africa? And that's the same question that the Nigerian vice president is asking. He's asking, are we sure that the West second guessing of China's influence and input in Africa is coming from an honest place, or is just another move on the broad chess game always played by the West when it comes to Africa?
Most African countries, as you can imagine, are, in my view, rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. China also shows up when the West will not or is reluctant to show up. And many African countries, of course, are of the view that the warnings about the Chinese Trojan loans may be wise, but are probably self-serving. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and the Chinese offer them. In any case, the history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere.
Hello there, how are you doing? My name is Sandiro Ganga. Welcome again to these videos where we sit down and discuss the place of Africans and Black Americans in the global landscape and how they can rise and take up a seat at the table. My name is Sandiro. I am a business journalist by profession, and I'm also a digital content creator. You can catch me on my YouTube channel at Sandiro Ganga, where we discuss all matters diaspora, relocation back to the continent. Or you can also connect with me on social media at Andiro Ganga on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. As I was browsing through YouTube, I bumped into a very interesting speech by the Vice President of Nigeria, Mr. Osibanjo. Now, this comes at a time when the continent is just fresh of Kamala Harris's visit, and this visit was touted to sort of counter the influence of China to the continent. But ironically, I don't know if the West is unfamiliar with how China has built their influence on the continent. They built that influence by being allies, by bringing development projects, by giving Africans funding, by taking up massive infrastructural projects on the continent that directly benefit Africans. Unfortunately, when the Vice President Kamala Harris was here, as Fox News would say, all she served was a word salad. It was talk and talk and talk and very little action. And there were pledges here and there, but they're not substantial pledges that can steer Africa in the direction of economic development and progress. You know, her speech was characterized by things like, oh, we support women empowerment, the youth are the future of Africa, Africa is coming up really well, Africa is our peers. Okay, let's start with Africa is our peers. We're your peers. Then why is it that there's a huge trade imbalance between Africa and America? Why is it that when it comes to conversations in terms of lending, in terms of funding, it comes with so many bottlenecks and hurdles? Why is it that your values are yes and amen, and Africans cannot exist just as Africans and dictate what is right for them? Why? When you say women empowerment, what do you mean? When you say the youth are the future of the continent, what do you mean? We've known that Africa is a young continent, median age is between 17 to 19 years old. So what do you mean? She only regurgitated all the things that we knew and said some of the most redundant things that we've had over and over and over again. And so if this trip was meant to counter China's influence on the continent, I dare say that it was a terrible fail. And the Nigerian vice president also shares the same sentiment. You know, he speaks very strongly about the Africa and America summit that was held in December. And this summit was meant to sort of, you know, build relationships between Africa and America, but that's what it looks like on textbook. In reality, it was just a forum where America talks about America, the place of America, what America wants, what America needs, and very little about how can we partner as even if not as equals, how can we enter into mutually beneficial relationships that, in as much as America is gaining, Africa also has something to gain from it, you know? And, you know, most of these conversations are always centered on the Chinese and how they've infiltrated the continent and the influence that they have so far on the continent and the kind of effects that this could have. But the Nigerian vice president says, hold up, wait a minute. You know, you cannot just be out here trying to rubbish the influence of China on Africa. There are substantial things that China has done on the continent that we cannot overlook.
In mid-December last year, the US hosted the Africa-US Summit. Only the second of such, the last was sometime in 2014. And there was no question at all that the summit was meant to at least register America's interest in being a more active player in Africa in response to, you know, the evident dominance of the Chinese. China is Africa's largest bilateral trading partner. And China does about $254 billion in trade in Africa. In 2021, it did about $254 billion in trade. China is also the largest provider of foreign direct investment in Africa, supporting hundreds of thousands of African jobs. Now, this is roughly double the level of US foreign direct investment, and China remains by far the largest lender to African countries. Chinese companies have also taken the lead in exploring minerals in Africa, many now in lithium, mining in Mali, in Guinea, in Nigeria, in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Zimbabwe, and in Namibia. Most African countries, as you can imagine, are, in my view, rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. China also shows up when the West will not or is reluctant to show up.
The main point of argument that always comes up when you raise the China issue on the continent is always, but do you know how you repay the debt? Do you know China repossessed the port in Sri Lanka? Do you know how Zambia is suffering because of its debt and indebtedness to China? But China has been lending to very many African countries, and these are isolated incidents where if you're unable to pay your debt, then it comes with consequences. Let us not kid ourselves. Even Western lending institutions have their own brute ways of getting back their money. Just recently, IMF is coming under scrutiny for all the aggressive revenue raising mechanisms that it imposes on countries that need revenue from them. So you're not repossessing somebody's port, but you're forcing them to add taxes on already overtaxed substances, you know, and you're sort of exploiting the very people that you're supposed to be helping, you know. If you're unable to pay, most of these Western countries will come for your mines, will come for your reserves, will ask you to privatize some of your state-owned agencies so that their people can buy. So this is nothing new. It's nothing new that China is doing. The West is just mad that China is doing what they do, you know. And we always inflate the debt that Africa owes China. Vice President Osibanjo says it's not as inflated as the world wants you to believe. Actually, China's debt or rather Africa's debt to China is a very small portion, and by a large extent, it's very manageable.
Many African countries, of course, are of the view that the warnings about the Chinese Trojan loans may be wise, but are probably self-serving. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and the Chinese offer them. In any case, the history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere. And the preoccupation of Western governments and the media with the so-called China debt trap might well be an overreaction. And I would recommend to you a very eye-opening lecture by Professor Deborah Brottigam about 2 weeks ago. She gave the lecture about 2 weeks ago at the Jesus College, Cambridge. The truth, as she points out, is that all of China's lending to Africa is only 5%. I think she's, roughly accurate there, of all the outstanding public and publicly guaranteed debt in low and middle income countries, compared to 23% held by the World Bank and other multilaterals. Chinese lenders account for just 12% of Africa's private and public external debt. And the Chinese, as I've said, have always been there when the debt even cannot be paid. In early 2020, as COVID battered African economies and, of course, economies worldwide, China came together with other G20 members to launch the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI as it was called. 73 low-income countries benefited from the suspension of principal and interest payments through the DSSI. Chinese banks provided 63% of the total debt relief, while it only owed 30% of the debt service payments that were due. So, by and large, in the arguments about Chinese, how, the Chinese debt trap, as sometimes called, and the large amounts of loans to African countries, etc. I think that what is clear is that the Chinese have proved to be, by and large, quite responsible in their approach to the giving of these loans. Of course, there are always arguments about whether or not you get the very best deal all the time.
This was my first time listening to Vice President Osibanjo, and his eloquence and his attention to detail and his knowledge of issues, of facts was just it was a breath of fresh air for me. I'll be looking out for more of his speeches. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you make of his iterations. Do you agree with him? Do you disagree with him? Let me know what you think in the comment section. My name is Ndiro Ganga. I'll see you next time. Until then, you can catch me on my YouTube channel at Ndiro Ganga, or connect with me on social media at Ndiro Ganga on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. See you.